The richest cowboy in Dry Creek walked past every wealthy woman in town and stopped at the door of the one person nobody expected him to choose. Rain slammed against the canyon rocks as Ivy tightened her grip on the rifle, her horse shaking beneath her. Below, cattle crashed through the dark while a gunshot ripped across Devil's Pass. Then she saw it, the flash of steel aimed straight at Travis Whitmore's back. Her finger pulled the trigger before she could even breathe. But what happened between them after that storm was something nobody in Dry Creek could have predicted. If stories like this stay with your heart, come right along with us. By the summer of 1887, Dry Creek looked like a town the wind had forgotten. Dust sat on the storefront windows so thick that even the barber no longer bothered wiping it away. The wooden water tower near the train tracks groaned every afternoon under the heat. Out past the hills, cattle wandered slowly through grass, brittle enough to crumble in a man's hand. Folks in Weston County had started measuring time by what disappeared. Another dried-up creek bed. Another ranch sold to Clayton Burke's bank. Another family packing furniture into wagons before sunrise. The only thing that still seemed untouched was Black Ridge Ranch, and the man who owned it. Travis Whitmore rode through town every Thursday morning, like clockwork, tall in the saddle, gray hat low over his eyes, dark coat carrying a trail of dust behind him. He rarely spoke unless business required it, and even then his words came short and clean. People respected him the way they respected winter storms. From a distance, at the Silver Spur Diner, old men leaned over coffee cups and guessed who Travis would finally marry. Most agreed on the same answer: Clara Montgomery, pretty, educated back east, daughter of a cattle investor, with enough money to protect Black Ridge from Burke's bank another 10 years. It made sense, and in Dry Creek, people trusted what made sense. That Thursday morning, Travis rode past the Montgomery Hotel without slowing down, past the diner, past the sheriff's office. He kept riding until the clean streets gave way to the older end of town, near the abandoned rail station where freight cars no longer stopped. A faded wooden sign swung above a narrow storefront: Bennett Repairs, harness work, coat mending, tack stitching. Inside, Ivy Bennett sat beneath the window repairing a split saddle strap. The room smelled faintly of leather oil and cedar soap. A kettle warmed near the stove even in the heat. 2 stray cats slept beneath the cutting table. She heard the horse stop outside before she looked up. Heavy boots crossed the porch. The door opened. The little bell above it gave a tired ring. Travis Whitmore stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ivy placed the saddle strap down carefully beside the needle tin. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. A faint line of dust crossed one cheek from where she must have brushed against leather earlier. "You're early for Thursday deliveries," she said. Her voice stayed calm. No flutter, no performance. Travis removed his gloves slowly. "I didn't come for repairs." Outside, somebody across the street paused, sweeping the boardwalk. People noticed when Travis Whitmore entered places he normally ignored. Ivy studied him another second. "Then what did you come for?" The wind pushed against the windows softly. Travis looked directly at her. "I need a wife." The broom outside stopped moving. A wagon horse snorted somewhere down the street. Ivy did not laugh. She only leaned back slightly in her chair, searching his face for mockery and finding none. "You should ask someone who wants your money," she said. "That's exactly why I'm here instead." The silence after that stretched longer than either expected. Travis glanced once around the little shop, the patched curtains, the worn floorboards. A coffee cup with a hairline crack near the stove, everything neat despite age and poverty. "You know who I am," he said. "Everyone does. And you know what people are saying." Ivy gave the smallest nod. Word had traveled all month that Black Ridge Ranch was hanging by a thread tied to a land agreement. If Travis failed to marry before autumn, certain transport rights would fall straight into Clayton Burke's hands. People assumed a wealthy rancher would solve that problem with another wealthy family. Not here. Not like this. Travis rested one hand against the counter. This would be legal, respectable. You'd have your own room, your own money. Nobody would trouble you again. Ivy almost smiled at that. People always trouble somebody, she said quietly. For the first time, something shifted in Travis's expression. Not amusement exactly. Recognition, maybe. Outside, more people had started slowing near the storefront windows. Dry Creek could smell gossip before it even happened. Travis noticed the movement beyond the glass. Then he said the thing that made the entire town stop breathing. "Marry me anyway." 3 days later, every pew inside the small church on Willow Road was filled. Not because people wished them well. Because they wanted to see it with their own eyes. The preacher cleared his throat twice before beginning. Sweat rolled beneath collars despite the open windows. Somewhere outside, a loose shutter banged against the church wall in the hot wind. Ivy stood alone near the altar, in a dark brown dress she had altered herself the night before. No lace, no flowers. Her hands remained folded calmly at her waist. Whispers moved through the benches behind her, like dry grass catching sparks. Then Travis entered. The room quieted immediately. He walked straight to the altar without looking toward the crowd once. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. No smiling, no music. When the preacher asked Travis his intentions, he answered plainly. "This marriage protects my family's land agreement." A few people exchanged looks. Ivy heard them. She heard every chair creak and every muffled whisper near the back row. Still, she kept her chin level. When the vows ended, Travis touched his lips briefly to her cheek. Nothing more, cold, careful, distant, like signing a document neither person fully trusted yet. That night, Black Ridge Ranch stood dark against the Wyoming hills. The main house was larger than Ivy expected. Long hallways, tall windows, the faint smell of pine smoke trapped in old wood. Travis carried her single suitcase upstairs himself. He stopped beside the last room at the end of the eastern hallway and opened the door. "This room is yours," he said. A narrow bed sat beneath the window. Clean sheets, a small washstand, one oil lamp already lit. Ivy stepped inside slowly. Behind her, Travis rested a hand against the doorframe. "You won't be expected to step into my personal affairs," he said. "This arrangement only needs to appear real to the outside world." Ivy turned slightly toward him. And inside the house, his eyes held hers for one quiet second. "Inside the house," he said carefully, "you'll be left in peace." She nodded once. "That's more than most people offer." Travis gave no answer to that. He stepped back into the hallway. The door closed softly between them. Almost no sound at all. But instead of walking away immediately, Travis remained standing there in the dark corridor, while the wind moved against the windows downstairs. Inside the room, Ivy unpacked slowly. One folded disc, a Bible with loose stitching, a tin box holding sewing needles and receipts, nothing else. Beyond the door, the house stayed quiet. Yet for the first time in years, Black Ridge no longer sounded empty. Morning came pale and dry across the Wyoming hills. Wind rattled lightly against the porch screens, while the first sunlight crept over the far pasture fences. Ivy woke before dawn out of habit. For a moment she stayed still beneath the unfamiliar quilt, listening. Floorboards settling somewhere downstairs, a horse stamping outside the stable, the distant groan of the ranch windmill turning slow in weak air, no voices, no family moving through rooms, just space. She dressed quietly in the half-dark, plain shirt, worn riding trousers beneath her skirt in case work needed doing later. She braided her hair tight at the back of her neck and washed her face using water from the porcelain basin beside the bed. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty except for a black coffee pot resting near dead ashes. Travis had already left. A plate sat beside the stove covered with a cloth napkin, biscuits, salt pork. Nothing fancy, but warm enough to tell her somebody had risen early to prepare it. Ivy noticed the second coffee cup beside the sink, unused. She poured herself coffee anyway, and sat alone at the long kitchen table while the clock ticked softly above the pantry door. Black Ridge Ranch was too large for silence. That was what struck her most. Big houses were supposed to sound alive. This one sounded careful. Later that morning, Ivy stepped outside carrying a tin pail toward the stable yard. The sun had already turned sharp overhead, though it was barely 8. Several ranch hands stood near the trough, smoking and talking low. Their conversation thinned when they saw her coming. Not hostile exactly, just uncertain. One younger cowboy nudged another with his elbow. "Morning, Mom," he muttered. Ivy nodded once and continued past them. Inside the stable, heat and hay settled heavy in the air. A chestnut mare shifted restlessly in the far stall. One of the animals coughed deep in its throat. Ivy paused. Then she walked closer. The horse's breathing sounded wrong, tight. Labored after only a short walk across the stall, she rested a hand gently along its neck. Warm. Too warm. A stable boy appeared carrying brushes under one arm. "That mare's been acting strange all week." "No vet," he shook his head, "Mr. Whitmore's been busy moving cattle west." Ivy crouched near the water bucket. The smell hit her first, metal, not strong, faint but there. She dipped 2 fingers into the water and rubbed them together slowly. Then she stood and looked toward the open pasture beyond the stable doors. Dry wind rolled across the fields in uneven waves. That afternoon, while most of the ranch worked fencing near the South Ridge, Ivy wandered farther west alone. She followed narrow cattle trails through brittle grass until she reached the lower watering route. The creek bed there had nearly vanished. Only mud remained in patches beneath cracked earth. She crouched beside the bank and studied the hoof marks. Too many. The herd had been driven here too often. A shadow crossed behind her. "You planning to fix the weather too, Travis?" Ivy looked up slowly. He sat tall in the saddle, hat brim low against the sun. Dust coated the sleeves of his coat. He looked tired in the way men looked when they stopped sleeping properly months ago. "I'm planning to understand why your cattle are weakening," she answered. Travis glanced toward the creek. "We've had drought for nearly 2 years. Everybody's cattle are weak. Not like this." That made him look at her again. Ivy pointed toward the ground. "The grazing route's wrong. They're walking too far for water, and this creek's nearly dead." Travis dismounted without a word. His boots sank slightly into dry soil as he approached. Ivy stepped aside while he examined the cracked creek bed himself. "You can tell all that from hoof prints?" "Not just hoof prints." She pointed toward the grass farther uphill, the west sides being eaten too short. "The roots won't recover before winter." Wind moved between them softly. For a long moment, Travis said nothing. Most men would have dismissed her. She could see the habit in him, trying to rise now, the habit of believing only his own judgment. But then his eyes drifted once more across the exhausted land, and something quieter settled in its place. "How long have you known ranch work?" he asked. Ivy brushed dust from her palms. "Long enough. That doesn't answer the question." "No," she said calmly. "It doesn't." The corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. Back at the ranch house that evening, Travis spread ledgers across the dining table after supper. Ivy expected him to send her away. Instead, he pulled out the opposite chair. "Sit." She hesitated only a second before doing so. The oil lamp between them flickered gold across paper columns and faded ink. Travis tapped one line with his finger. "Feed costs rose here." Ivy leaned forward slightly. Their shoulders nearly touched before both noticed and shifted apart again. She studied the numbers. Then another page. Then another. "Your west routes are overworked," she said quietly. "And somebody's mixing cheaper filler into the feed shipments." Travis looked up sharply. You're certain? Ivy slid the ledger toward him. Real grain doesn't leave dust like that at the bottom of sacks. Silence settled over the table. Outside, a gate banged once in the wind. Travis stared down at the books for a long time before speaking again. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. You notice a great deal. Ivy folded her hands calmly in her lap. When people spend enough years overlooked, she said, they learn to pay attention. Something changed in the room after that. Not warmth, not yet. But the hard distance between them no longer felt quite as fixed as it had 3 nights earlier. Upstairs later, Ivy passed the study on her way to bed. The door stood half open. Inside, Travis remained bent over the ranch maps with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, lantern light catching the tired lines near his eyes. For the first time since arriving at Black Ridge, Ivy stopped outside his doorway instead of hurrying past it, and inside the study, without lifting his head, Travis somehow knew she was there. You should be asleep, he said quietly. The lamp beside him burned low, throwing long shadows across the maps spread over the desk. A half-empty coffee cup sat near his elbow. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. Ivy leaned lightly against the doorway. So should you. That almost earned a smile. Almost. Travis finally looked up. His eyes lingered on her a second longer than necessary, before drifting back to the ledgers. The west pasture's worse than I thought, he admitted. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods near the stable. Somewhere far off, a loose chain knocked softly against wood. Ivy stepped inside the room. Not far. Just enough for the floorboards beneath her boots to creak once. The cattle aren't the only thing being drained, she said. Travis frowned slightly. She nodded toward the shipment receipts near his hand. Feed costs, fuel, replacement tack. Somebody's taking more than they should. Silence settled between them. Then, Travis slid the papers toward her without argument. It was the first time he had done that. The first time he allowed another pair of eyes fully into Black Ridge business. Over the following weeks, small changes moved quietly across the ranch. Fence lines shifted west. A dried-out well near Juniper Ridge was dug open again. Water routes shortened. The cattle stopped crowding the dead creek bed. Nobody announced the improvements out loud, but men noticed. Ranch hands, who had laughed when Ivy first saddled a horse, now tipped their hats when she crossed the yard. Not all of them. Hank Doyle watched her with the same flat expression he always wore. Hank had managed Black Ridge nearly 10 years. Thick shoulders, gray mustache, eyes that never revealed much. He spoke politely enough. But there was always something held back behind it. One afternoon, Ivy found him standing beside the feed shed while 2 workers unloaded grain sacks. She crouched beside one of the open bags and rubbed dust between her fingers. Too much filler. Again. You got something to say? Hank asked. His voice stayed even, though the muscles in his jaw tightened. Ivy stood slowly. Only that your supplier's cheating somebody. Been using the same supplier since before you arrived. That doesn't make him honest. Hank's eyes narrowed slightly. Across the yard, Travis stepped out from the stable carrying a saddle blanket over one arm. He glanced once between them. Nobody spoke after that. But Hank walked away first. That evening, rain clouds rolled over the Wyoming hills for the first time in weeks. Thin lightning flickered somewhere beyond Devil's Pass, while Dry Creek shut its windows against the coming storm. Inside the Silver Spur Saloon, voices rose louder than usual beneath the smell of whiskey and wet coats. Ivy sat near the back wall waiting on a food order. Martha had asked her to collect from town. She kept her gloves folded neatly beside her untouched coffee. Most folks avoided staring directly now. Most. A woman near the bar laughed too sharply at something nobody else found funny. Well, she drawled, guess anybody can become a ranch wife these days if the paperwork's right. A few uncomfortable chuckles followed. Ivy kept her eyes on the coffee cup. Then came the sound of a whiskey glass settling heavily onto wood. Travis. He had entered so quietly half the room never noticed. Now every voice stopped. Travis stood near the bar, tall and still beneath dripping rainwater from his coat brim. "Say it again," he said calmly. Nobody moved. The woman shifted awkwardly. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." His voice never rose. That somehow made it worse. The piano player near the corner slowly removed his hands from the keys. Travis looked toward the woman one final second. "Apologize to my wife." The words hung in the room hard and clean. Not arrangement, not obligation. My wife. The woman swallowed quickly before mumbling an apology toward Ivy without meeting her eyes. Travis gave a short nod. Then he crossed the saloon, picked up Ivy's parcel from the counter, and held the door open for her without another word. Rain hammered the boardwalk outside. They walked side by side beneath the dark storm without speaking. But Ivy noticed something as they reached his wagon. Travis waited for her to climb inside first. A small thing. Still, she noticed. The storm worsened after midnight. Wind slammed against Black Ridge, hard enough to rattle window panes. Horses shifted nervously in the stable. Somewhere outside, a gate banged over and over in uneven rhythm. Ivy woke instantly. She sat upright in bed, listening. Bang, bang, not the wind, a gate left open. She pulled on boots and hurried downstairs, carrying a lantern. Rain lashed sideways across the yard the moment she stepped outside. Near the southern fence line, shadows moved through the storm. Cattle running. Then came the gunshot. Sharp, close, men shouted from the stable. Another shot cracked through the rain. Ivy saw Travis already mounting his horse beneath the lantern glow, while ranch hands scrambled for rifles. The South heard somebody yelled. The gate hung wide open, too wide, too deliberate. Hank Doyle emerged from the darkness, fastening his coat. Rustlers drove him toward Devil's Pass. Travis swung into the saddle immediately. Then he looked toward Ivy standing in the rain. "Stay inside." She didn't answer. Within seconds, the riders thundered out into the storm. Ivy watched them disappear into darkness. Then her eyes drifted toward Devil's Pass beyond the Black Hills. Narrow cliffs, blind turns. Perfect place for an ambush. Her stomach tightened. Without wasting another second, Ivy crossed the yard toward the smaller stable, grabbed a rifle from the rack beside the tack room, and saddled the chestnut mare herself. Rainwater streamed down her sleeves as she mounted. By the time she rode out through the southern gate, thunder was rolling hard across the Wyoming sky. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, another gunshot echoed through the hills. Rain slashed across Ivy's face as the mare climbed the narrow trail toward Devil's Pass. Mud splashed beneath the horse's hooves. The lantern tied near her saddle swung wildly with every sharp turn. Ahead, cattle thundered through the canyon like a living storm. She could hear men shouting over the rain. Then, another shot cracked through the dark. Ivy pulled the mare hard around a bend and saw them below. Travis and 3 ranch hands were trying to turn the herd away from the ravine edge, while shadows moved among the rocks higher up the pass. Too many shadows, not rustlers chasing cattle, men waiting. Lightning split the sky for one bright second. And in that flash, Ivy saw the rifle barrel aimed directly at Travis's back. Everything after that happened fast. She lifted the rifle without thinking and fired toward the ridge. The shot struck stone near the gunman's hand. Sparks burst against wet rock. His bullet fired wild into the storm instead of into Travis. Shouting exploded through the canyon. Horses reared. The cattle broke apart in panic, but the ambush had already failed. The men hidden along the ridge scattered into darkness as Travis and the others pushed the herd back from the cliff trail. Rain swallowed the rest. For several long seconds nobody moved. Then Travis turned. Even through the storm, Ivy saw the change in his face when he realized who had fired the warning shot. He rode straight toward her. Water streamed from the brim of his hat. His jaw looked tight enough to crack. When he reached her horse, he grabbed the reins first. Then his eyes moved over her, quickly, checking for blood, for injury, for proof she was still standing there. "What were you thinking?" he said. His voice came rougher than usual. Ivy held the rifle tightly across her lap. "You were about to get yourself killed. That wasn't your fight. It became my fight when somebody opened your gates." The wind howled through the canyon between them. Travis stared at her another second. Rainwater ran down his face unnoticed. Then something in him seemed to give way all at once. Not anger, fear, real fear. His hand closed around her wrist just above the glove. Firm, warm despite the cold rain. "Are you hurt?" Ivy shook her head slowly. Only then did his grip loosen. Behind them, one of the ranch hands called out that the herd was turning back toward Black Ridge. Another man cursed about losing the rustlers in the storm. Travis never looked away from Ivy. On the ride home, he kept his horse beside hers the entire way. Not ahead, beside. The storm passed before dawn. By sunrise, Black Ridge smelled of wet dirt and soaked cedar. Ranch hands moved slowly through the yard, carrying lanterns and checking damaged fences. Mud clung thick to boots. Horses stood steaming in the cold morning air. Ivy entered the kitchen quietly, exhausted from the night. Martha looked up from the stove. The older woman had barely spoken more than 10 words to Ivy since the wedding. But now her eyes lingered differently. "You should sit," she said gruffly. Ivy blinked once in surprise. Martha slid a hot cup of coffee toward her across the table. No smile came with it. Still, it was something. A few minutes later, Travis walked in. He had changed clothes but not slept. Damp hair still clung slightly near his collar. A fresh scrape marked one side of his jaw. The room grew still when he entered. Martha suddenly found reasons to busy herself near the pantry shelves. Travis poured coffee into a tin cup but didn't drink it. Instead, he looked toward Ivy. "You shouldn't have followed us." Ivy wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "And if I hadn't," he gave no answer, because both of them already knew. Silence stretched softly between them. Then Travis crossed the kitchen and placed something beside her plate. Her rifle, cleaned, every trace of mud carefully wiped away. "I fixed the jam near the chamber," he said quietly. Trigger was sticking. Ivy looked at the rifle for a moment before lifting her eyes toward him again. "Thank you." Travis nodded once. Not formal, not distant, something else. That evening, the rain returned lightly against the ranch windows. Not violent this time, just steady enough to soften the dry earth outside. Ivy sat in the study, reviewing supply invoices while Travis worked through cattle reports beside her. The oil lamp cast warm light across the desk between them. No one had asked her to stay there. She simply had. Every so often their hands brushed lightly, reaching for papers or pencils. Each time both paused almost without meaning to. Neither mentioned it. Near midnight, Ivy leaned back slightly in the chair, rubbing tiredness from her eyes. "You missed this line," she murmured. Travis glanced over. She pointed toward a transport receipt dated 2 weeks earlier. A shipment marked delivered had never reached the ranch inventory. Travis's expression darkened slowly. "Hank signed this." Ivy looked toward the rain-streaked windows. "He's connected somehow," she said carefully. "Maybe not alone, but he knows more than he admits." The room fell quiet again. Outside, water dripped steadily from the porch roof. Travis stared down at the papers for a long moment before finally speaking. "If you're right." He stopped there. Ivy watched him from across the desk. He looked tired suddenly. Older than before, not weak, just carrying too much alone for too long. Without thinking much about it, Ivy pushed the coffee pot gently closer to his side of the desk. The gesture was small. Still, Travis noticed. His eyes lifted toward her. And for the first time since the marriage began, the silence between them no longer felt cold. Rain tapped softly against the study windows while the lamp burned low between them. Travis sat back in his chair, one hand resting near the stack of freight invoices Ivy had uncovered. Neither of them spoke for a while. The room no longer needed constant words. Outside, Black Ridge settled into the wet quiet that came after storms. Horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere down the hall, Martha closed a cupboard door before heading upstairs for the night. Travis finally reached for the coffee Ivy had pushed toward him earlier. It had gone lukewarm. Still, he drank it. The next morning brought clear skies and hard sunlight across the ranch. Mud clung thick around the stable yard, but the air smelled cleaner than it had in months. Ivy crossed the porch carrying a ledger beneath one arm when she noticed two unfamiliar riders near the front gate. Bankmen. Even from a distance, their coats gave them away. Dark wool despite the heat, clean boots untouched by ranch dirt. One of them handed a folded document to Travis without dismounting. Travis read it once, then again slower. Ivy watched the muscle tighten near his jaw. "What is it?" she asked after the riders left. Travis folded the paper carefully, too carefully. Clayton Burke's contesting the West water rights. The words settled heavily between them. Without those rights, Black Ridge would lose nearly half its grazing land before winter. Ivy held out her hand silently. After a moment, Travis passed her the document. Official stamps covered the bottom, county seals, signatures, legal language meant to sound final. But Ivy noticed something else. Dates. 3 approvals processed on the same afternoon, through offices usually separated by weeks. "That's too fast," she murmured. Travis looked toward her. "You think Burke paid somebody?" "I think he paid several somebodies." By noon, the news had spread through Dry Creek. At the barber shop, the diner, the church steps. People lowered their voices when Black Ridge was mentioned now. Some believed Travis was finally losing his grip. Others quietly waited to see how much land Burke would swallow next. That afternoon, Ivy rode into town alone, carrying a leather satchel filled with copies of shipping records and water agreements. The streets looked different than they had weeks ago. Not friendlier, but less closed. Old Mr. Harlan from Miller Ranch tipped his hat when she passed the feed store. A woman outside the bakery held the door open instead of looking away. Small things. Still, Ivy noticed them all. She spent the rest of the day moving between ranches north of Dry Creek. Small places barely surviving the drought. Families who had nearly signed their land over to Burke's Bank already. At each ranch she spread maps across kitchen tables. Not promise facts, shared wells. Rotating pasture routes, fair transport schedules. Most importantly, proof that Burke's contracts always ended the same way. Ownership disappeared, one ranch at a time. By sunset, Ivy returned to Black Ridge exhausted and covered in road dust. Travis sat alone on the porch steps, sharpening a pocket knife when she rode in. The fading light painted long shadows across the yard. "You missed supper," he said quietly. "I brought back 3 signed agreements." That got his attention. Ivy dismounted slowly, stiff from hours in the saddle. Before she could tie the reins properly, Travis stood and took the horse from her himself. Again, a small thing. Still, she noticed. Inside the house, Martha reheated stew without complaint. A fresh loaf of bread sat warming near the stove wrapped in cloth. While Ivy ate, Travis studied the signed papers one by one beneath the kitchen lamp. "They trust you," he said finally. Ivy tore a small piece of bread between her fingers. "No. They trust someone finally telling them the truth." Travis looked at her across the table longer than usual. The kitchen had grown warmer lately, softer somehow. The kind of warmth that settled slowly into walls after years of cold weather. Later that night, Ivy carried fresh documents into the study, only to find Travis asleep in the chair beside the desk. The lamp still burned near his shoulder. One hand remained loose, curled around a pencil. For a moment, she simply stood there. He looked different asleep, younger almost, less guarded. Ivy stepped closer quietly and lifted the ledger slipping from his lap. As she set it onto the desk, Travis stirred awake. Their faces ended up nearer than either expected. Neither moved immediately. The room stayed perfectly still, except for the soft crackle of lamp oil. "You should rest more," Ivy whispered. Travis looked at her like he wanted to say something larger than the moment allowed. Instead, he reached slowly toward her hand resting on the desk. His fingers brushed hers lightly, carefully. Not accidental this time. Ivy felt her breath catch before she could hide it. Travis noticed. His thumb moved once against the side of her hand. Then very gently, as if giving her every chance to refuse, he stood. The kiss came slowly, no rush, no force. Just the warmth of another person finally stepping through a doorway both had been circling for weeks. Ivy closed her eyes briefly. Outside, wind moved softly through the cottonwoods. Inside the study, Travis rested his forehead lightly against hers after the kiss ended. Neither spoke. The silence between them had changed again. Not cold now, not uncertain. Something quieter. Something neither of them knew how to name yet. The next morning, that feeling shattered. Hank Doyle stood waiting near the stable, with 2 packed saddlebags already tied beside his horse. Travis stopped short when he saw him. "I was hoping we'd speak private," Hank said. But Ivy noticed the folded bank receipt sticking from the older man's coat pocket before anyone else did. Clayton Burke's bank seal, stamped clearly across the corner. And suddenly, every strange thing at Black Ridge began falling into place. The missing feed, the opened gates, the whispers moving through Dry Creek like smoke through cracked walls. Some betrayals arrive loud. Others sit quietly at your own table, for years before you finally see them clearly. Maybe that's why this story stays with people. Because most of us know what it feels like to wonder if we truly belong somewhere. To walk into a room already carrying the weight of other people's opinions. To keep showing kindness anyway. Keep standing beside someone, even when it would be easier to leave. Ivy never forced Travis to change. She simply stayed honest in a world that had grown used to masks. And little by little, that honesty gave a lonely man something he hadn't carried in a very long time. Peace. Sometimes love doesn't arrive like thunder rolling across the mountains. Sometimes it sounds like boots stopping outside your doorway at night. A cup of coffee pushed closer across a table. A hand reaching back for yours after a hard ride home. And maybe the real miracle isn't being chosen. Maybe it's finding someone who finally sees you clearly and stays. If this story reminded you of someone who stood beside you when life got hard, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. And if these quiet Western stories bring you comfort at the end of a long day, there'll always be another firelit porch, another dusty road, and another unforgettable heart waiting for you here.